Welcome to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, where we talk about historical drama series and films as windows to the past and mirrors of the present. I'm Michonne Boston.
And I'm Tequina Boston. Have you ever wondered what it took to be a fashionista during Jane Austen's Regency era, or in the early days of a newly independent America across the ocean? In this episode, the first part of a two-part conversation about Regency fashion in history and on the screen, we talk with costume historian and curator Alden O'Brien. We explore with Alden the fascinating elements of style in Regency and Federal era clothing, the sources for materials, inspirations, and the fashion clues that bring Jane Austen's characters to life.
Jane Austen is beloved for her novels that capture English country life, societal norms, and romances that hinge on the quest for a financially advantageous marriage. Today, her popularity continues to soar, especially through modern adaptations like Emma, which got a contemporary twist in the film Clueless, and, of course, Pride and Prejudice. This classic has not only introduced many to Jane Austen's world, but has also served as a romantic blueprint for navigating the complexities of love, expectation, and miscommunication. And who could forget Mr. Darcy, the brooding hero who has captivated so many hearts? For years, Tequina and I followed the activities of the Jane Austen Society of North America, or JASNA, having been inspired by the television adaptations of Austen's novels. This year, in celebration of Jane Austen's 250th birthday, we decided to take the leap and become JASNA members. And we're loving it.
This past October, we attended our first JASNA annual general meeting held in Baltimore, Maryland, where we discovered fellow members that have been listening to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters. And we saw JASNA members in very impressive Regency attire, taking a turn about the hotel passageways and inside the ballroom. As we wrap up 2025 and honor Jane Austen's milestone birthday, we're excited to share 3 special podcasts with you. All 3 draw from our experiences at the JASNA annual general meeting with presenters from the event.
Our guest for this podcast is Alden O'Brien, curator of costume and textiles at the DAR, that's Daughters of the American Revolution Museum in Washington, D.C. Alden earned her bachelor's in art history from Barnard College and a master's in museum studies focused on costume and textiles from the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York City. After a year with the First Lady's collection at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, Alden found her home at the DAR Museum, curating its remarkable costume collection. Alden has curated DAR Museum exhibitions on costume, quilts, childhood toys, and needlework, and collaborated on many more. She plans to retire in January 2026 to delve into her own research projects that center around the Regency and Federal eras, as well as, of course, Jane Austen. Welcome, Alden, to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters.
Thank you.
Now, I have to admit, you're one of the reasons why we have this podcast.
That's
work
just
you
amazing.
do, the work you've done at DAR as a curator. So we want to take you back to your beginnings in this position. Tell us, what do you do at DAR, and what was the first costume exhibition you curated at, and DAR stands for Daughters of the American Revolution, here in Washington, D.C.?
Right. Well, first I should say that the collections here don't have anything to do with the revolution, and it's also not about the history of the DAR. It's the history of the American home. We collect decorative arts, we have period rooms, we have paintings and quilts and costumes and, silver and pewter and, porcelain, much more ordinary people's things. And, the DAR was collecting things especially pertinent to women's lives before there was such a phrase as women's history or social history. So they were interested in the ordinary stories and women's stories in American history. So I'm in charge of the clothing, and eventually, after a number of years here, I also took over the quilts and the coverlets and the household textiles like sheets and things. And they gave me the dolls and the toys. And in my quest for complete curatorial domination, they recently gave me the samplers and needlework when that curator retired. So I'm now in charge of all the things that are textile. And I've done a number of exhibits. The first one was just called American Women, American Fashion. And my co curator, um, uh, Cricket Bauer, at the time, was a staff member here. And we put it together something that looked at the European fashion plates and looked at American garments and said, how are the American women kind of modifying the high style? How are the American women reacting to that? And that was a small exhibit. And then a few years later, I did something called Costume Myths and Mysteries. And I tried to address a lot of sort of myths and misconceptions and sort of the frequently asked questions about how did they go to the bathroom and wasn't it uncomfortable and the myth of the 17-inch waist and various things and why would they wear something like that? It's hard for us to imagine the conventions that governed behavior and clothing back then. And since then, I've done a number of other things. Jane Austen fans might remember if they were here for the JASNA, Jane Austen Society of North America general meeting that was in Washington back in, I think it was 2016. I did an exhibit on Regency / Federal fashion from 1780 to about 1825, displayed in our period rooms. Each group of costumes, garments was displayed in a period room appropriate to its time. So that was sort of looking at the American version of Regency era and up to the Regency and a little bit past the Regency. So I have done something that was, very much tailored to the Jane Austen fan, although it had the American focus because that's what we collect.
I'm sorry I missed that exhibition.
Well, it's still online and we still have catalogs for sale.
Oh,
Okay, I'll
great.
check it out.
Yeah, it was the title was An Agreeable Tyrant: Fashion After the American Revolution. Fashion After the Revolution. And so it's at anagreeabletyrant.dar.org. So that's still online, and not every single garment is there, but it sort of talks about how the Americans were trying to figure out after the revolution, are we going to be independent of the European aristocratic-led fashions? We're trying to be a democracy. We should be setting our own fashions. And everyone was like, yeah, you remember that pursuit of happiness thing? That means we want to follow the pretty stuff coming out of England and France. So we were kind of navigating that philosophy, and women were just like, you know what, just send me the beautiful China silks and the beautiful Indian cottons, and I want to look like the chic English and French ladies. So we had a lot of nice things to show.
I think that's pretty prevalent even today.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. On the
Especially
other hand, America sets a lot of the fashions now. So, American street style, American, celebrity style. And I think fashion comes from a lot of different directions, and it's not just from the aristocracy down. It's a lot of trickle up, and it's a lot of sideways global influences. So the dynamics of fashion, I think, have changed a lot since the early 1800s.
for
It's
sure.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said about how people use the restroom, I'll say the
Oh,
restroom, in those fashions because, again, when we talk about mirror of the present, I think the same thing as I'm watching the red carpet for the Met Costume Institute
mhm.
event, I'm like, "How do they"
That's a lot. I'll give you a hint. Here's the thing. Until about 1800, nobody's wearing panties.
Ah.
So, people like Martha Washington and Jane Austen went commando. And so, yeah, I know that sounds shocking, but you still have the fabric to navigate, but you pull it up and you don't have any drawers or pantalettes to pull down. And when they do start wearing pantalettes, which start coming in during Jane Austen's lifetime, but it's not nearly as prevalent until later in the century, they're open crotch. I mean, they're cotton, they're not sexy. They're just linen and cotton, but they're open so that you tuck your chemise into it so that you can kind of, move the fabric around when you need to use the chamber stool or the chamber pot. So,
Actually, yeah, that's not shocking to me. I know people, I won't name names, but
I mean, it just sounds weird because we think of everybody being so prim and proper, and it's just that, you had these very long skirts, you weren't showing anything. It's just that for purely practical purposes, you needed to be able to do something in the middle of the day without completely undressing. So that's how you did it.
All right. So, in a sense, we've started off our conversation a little potty mouth here.
Yeah, sorry about that. I'm not sure how we got there.
ba-doom boom.
Through the myths and the mysteries of the frequently asked questions, how do they manage it?
Yeah.
Sorry
Well,
to
we
take you on a tangent right off the bat.
Oh, no, it's all interesting to me. So here we are. It's, the 250th anniversary of Jane Austen's birth. She was born December 16th, 1775, and it has been a year of all kinds of commemorations, programs, conferences, exhibitions. How did the Daughters of the American Revolution connect with this global celebration of Austen? What was their contribution to this tribute?
Well, what we did was I had a young colleague here on staff who has since gone into private practice as a textile conservator, but she was my intern and then she was on our education staff. And I gave her the opportunity to curate a small exhibit in our study gallery. We have a huge study gallery with over 1,000 pieces from all parts of our collection. And we have a costume case that we change every 6 months. And I said, "Why don't you curate something and just put together some kind of a theme?" And she said, "Well, let's do Jane Austen's 250th." And I said, "Great, everyone will love it." And so we pulled things from our exhibit, some of which had been in Agreeable Tyrant. And she decided to address some of the myths and misconceptions and about the period, some of the errors that you see in some of the costume dramas that are a lot of fun to watch, but might give you some misconceptions. And I'm not passing judgment; I enjoy them too. But as a historian, I sometimes go, I wish they'd put a chemise under that corset. Um, so, she addressed some of that. So there's an exhibit of about, I think it's 3 or 4 corsets and a dress that is, a a mannequin that's dressed in all the different layers, so you can see the chemise and the corset and the dress and the pocket and the petticoat, and then a couple of dresses accessorized with shawls and so on, and then we have some drawers with some accessories. So, that was up, and we just had to rotate them. You don't want costumes out for too long, costume and textiles out for too long. So I just rotated those out about a month ago with a new bunch of them, and that will be up until, I believe, early February. We have to install something by middle of March, so haven't been given an absolute date, but people can still come and see that, down here at DAR headquarters in, downtown Washington, DC. But do always check our website because we do have some holiday closures and things like that.
Mhm. And Michelle and I did have a chance to see the exhibition, or I would say maybe a version of it, in that you switch out
The earlier
costumes
version.
from
Oh,
time to
and I
time.
think I mentioned I wanted to give credit to Bella, and I don't think I actually gave her name. Isabella Moritz is the name of the curator of that exhibit, and so, she had that idea and put that together and put some myths and misconceptions in there.
Yeah, and she was there for the exhibition as well,
Yes.
so we had both of you. It was wonderful. What I learned listening to both of you is that what we refer to as the long Regency overlaps with a period in the United States. It's called the Federalist period.
Yeah,
And it's the first time I heard that. So could you talk a little bit about what defined Regency, what defined the Federalist period? And in
sure.
terms of attire, were there, because you talked a little bit about, are we going to be different or are we going to imitate Europe?
Right.
What impact did that have on the attire?
Right. Well, first of all, I'm just gonna tweak the language a little bit. It's not
Okay.
federalist, it's federal.
Federal. Okay.
Federalist is the political party and ideology about whether we're going to be very federal or more state-based power.
Okay. Okay. Thank
So
you.
that's yeah, so it's a very commonly used word. I think, very often people like to put the extra syllable on a word, and they think it sounds more formal or proper or something. But in this case, it changes the meaning. And federal is the word for the period, which is our early existence as a country. So about 1780 to about 1830 is the federal period. And the Regency, of course, in the most technical sense, is 1811 to 1820, when George III, our bad old tyrannical George III, he wasn't all that tyrannical, but we won't get into that. He was, mad, and they took the power from him and gave it to the Prince of Wales and created him as the regent, who then became George IV when George III died. So the Georgian period goes from about 1715, I think, when George I comes, all the way through the end of George IV to 1830. So this is called the late Georgian period. The Regency is technically 1811 to 1820. But when you're talking about design, I mean, design and literature and the arts and cultural movements don't align perfectly with political dates. So the federal period is too big for the Regency. The Regency period is too small for what we think of as that Regency Jane Austen look. Of course, Jane Austen wore other things than what we think of as being Jane Austen-y, but all of her novels are set or written between about 1797 and 1817 when she dies. So, and we call that style, the high-waisted style that we associate with Jane Austen, the Empire style. That's because the French were having their empire, but that goes from 1804 till when Napoleon was defeated finally in 1815. So none of these political definitions really match the fashion style that we're talking about. So the fashion style that we're talking about, that is characterized by what we see in all those Jane Austen adaptations, which is the high waist, the slim silhouette, the drapey folds. It's not stiff and it's not held out by hoops, and it's a much more natural bust, although it's definitely a raised bust. But it's a more natural shaped bust compared to what preceded it, which was that very cone shaped set of stays or corsetry of the 18th century, most of the 18th century. That comes in really just in the very last few years of the 1790s, 1796 or 7, you start seeing that really big shift to that. But the skirts are still somewhat fuller, but they're not anything like what we think of as the colonial period, or what Queen Charlotte wears in Bridgerton, or what you see in Williamsburg for the colonial period. It's a much more natural looking silhouette, and the higher waist and often low necklines. Although by 1810, you start having people filling in those necklines with little chemisettes and ruffles and kerchiefs. And in America, the more conservative people are keeping their little kerchiefs in their necks as well. So does that make sense?
Yeah. In fact, in terms of the podcast, we talk about it as being a window to the past and a mirror of the present.
Mm-hmm.
And having just attended the Jane Austen Society of North America annual general meeting in Baltimore in October, I was surprised that I actually like some things from Regency, because it's never been my favorite fashion
Uh-huh.
period.
Uh-huh.
But the turbans and the headgear
Mm-hmm.
were really very appealing to me, as well as the riding outfits. Because you talked a little bit about the America versus Europe. Are we going to be the same? Are we going to be different? And actually how it did reflect that despite this new identity that was being developed, people still were all about the fashion and the nice
Mm-hmm.
stuff. They still wanted
Mm-hmm.
nice things. So what aspects of that period can we still find in contemporary fashion? And I
Mm.
ask that because I was surprised to discover that some of the ways that I wrap scarves actually would have fit into the Regency period, and I
Yeah.
love the feathers too.
Yeah, the feathers are great. I think we need to bring back feathers. And, I think the bonnets, the full on Regency style bonnets, that's a little bit harder to identify with. I mean, as soon as you put on a bonnet, you're in a different period. We're not in Kansas anymore, Toto. But those turbans are great. And I think that might be one reason that they are popular for the people who want to get dressed at the Jane Austen things. Also, it's a lot easier to wrap a turban, even if you're going to, tack it down, sew it down to some kind of a frame underneath. It's a lot easier to achieve that than a bonnet, because bonnets are hard to make yourself and they're expensive if you buy them from someone else. Although there are some fabulous milliners who will make you a great Regency era or Victorian era bonnet, and I love them and I want to support them. But if you don't want to go that far, turbans are a great way to go. And of course, they were appropriating sort of an Orientalism, at the time. The neoclassical, the purely neoclassical trend of right around 1798 to the very, very early 1800s. Right away, we're always craving novelty. So it's like, okay, we've looked really, really Greco-Roman for a while. Now, what else is out there? And so it's like, well, let's try some Renaissance sleeves and let's try some military trim, because, all of our gallant soldiers are out there fighting Napoleon, or they're out on the Spanish Peninsula fighting whoever they were fighting. And so let's have some military trim, but let's combine it with a Renaissance, puffy sleeve. We've got this beautiful purple Spencer in the collection here that is in the Agreeable Tyrant exhibit, and it's got the combination of all of this wonderful trim. It's silk twill trim on velvet, um, looking like a hussar, toned down hussar uniform, but then it's got these Renaissance puffy sleeves. And that's just typical of what they were doing, is combining either historical or Oriental or military, or all these different kinds of mishmashed inspirations. But the turbans were very much going for the Turkish, or the Persian or the Egyptian. Napoleon was over there in Egypt, and there was an Egyptian campaign, and so Egyptian oid things were popular for a while there too. So all of that is quite fun. So, but back to the question of what is appealing about it to us today, I think that the Regency is this wonderful period in between the 18th century and the Victorian, where once you get much past about 1820, things start, the sleeves are getting bigger, the skirts are getting wider. By the time you're in 1830, you've got really big sleeves and you've got a fairly big skirt. You are starting to emphasize the waist again. So even though these corsets are not, as popular imagination has it, incredibly constricting, it's a lot of optical illusion with the big skirts and the big sleeves making the waist look small by comparison, and the lines of the seams emphasize that too. But you've got this magical moment before everything starts looking really kind of outlandish, in between the very stiff and formal and hooped look of the 18th century and the corseted and huge skirted period of the Victorians. The Regency looks relatively normal and
Yeah.
relatively natural and relatively modern. I think it's a whole lot more relatable to the modern eye. So I think that that's one reason that you get way more people dressing up for the Jane Austen kind of thing than if you went to a Dickens thing. I mean, there are certainly a lot of people who love dressing up in lots of different periods. And there's, I know some wonderful costumers who are just incredibly talented at recreating incredibly accurate things from the hoop period or the bustle period or the whatever, and more power to them. But it's a whole lot easier to just kind of put together a Jane Austen-y look without going to the extreme measures and expense than it is to do the colonial or the Victorian. So I think it's kind of this magic moment. And I think it's a magic moment culturally too, thinking about the mirror and the window. And I love how you phrase that. It's a window to the past that is not too fuzzy for us, and culturally, I think it's not too smeared and stained glass. I think it's relatively clear because you've got that Enlightenment, it's coming after the Enlightenment of the 18th century, where you've got this interest in science and the natural world and categorizing things and learning and this interest in freedom. You've got the philosophies of Rousseau and John Locke that informed our revolution about personal liberties and freedoms, and how the natural state of man should be, that of liberty. And so that extended very consciously to their attitudes about clothing. And so, Rousseau and Locke were saying, you shouldn't put children in corsets and restrictive clothing, and people should be able to move in their clothing. And, that's an attitude that we as modern people can identify with. And so that look and that culture, those cultural attitudes before the Victorians start clamming everything up again and getting incredibly moralistic and restrictive. You've got a whole lot of women leading society and leading salons and things like that, even in the 18th century. And it's starting to get more restricted in the Regency. You've got a few moralists who are starting to, throw their weight around. But it is this kind of magical medium moment. Ooh, how's that for alliteration? Between the 18th century and the Victorians that can really appeal to us.
Yeah, and I will say I've always admired the men's dress, and this year with the Costume Institute focusing on the dandy, it
Yes.
very much you could see that
Yes.
influence.
But it's a restrained dandyism.
Yeah,
So, the
yeah.
dandyism of the 18th century was much more, it was very colorful. It was all the embroidered waistcoats, and it was, and it's wonderful. And it's like, oh, the poor men have to wear these dull drab clothes now. But it was the restraint, the elegant restraint of the beautifully tailored coat in the dark colors, which could include, mulberry and garnet and bottle green and navy and slightly, brighter blue than that. But it's a very elegant look, that Regency look. And, you know, I love some tight breeches. I have no objection to those. I mean,
Yeah.
some of the earlier adaptations are very wishy-washy about that. They're like, okay, we're going to show the women's boobs, but we're not going to show the men's legs too much. And it's like these baggy breeches, and like, I'm sorry, I'm here to see some very cute men's, whatever,
Yeah.
and I'm not seeing it. But actually, that's where I give some kudos to Bridgerton, and some of the more recent adaptations have allowed the men to look their best.
Yeah, show the male form.
That's right.
Yeah, without having to go to the ballet.
That's
You're
right. How
right.
about that? How about that female gaze? Come on, girls,
Yeah.
it's our turn.
You've been enjoying Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, a podcast where we talk about historical drama films and series as windows to the past and mirrors of the present.
Make sure you subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. Share the excitement with your friends. Visit MichonneBostonGroup.com/Boston Sisters. Join the historical drama community by signing up for our e-newsletter so you'll never miss an update, future episodes, or exclusive bonus content.
Now, back to our fascinating conversation.
It's interesting when we talked about the turbans and the influences, because Turkey was real big
Oh, yeah.
in those times, but also Jane Austen makes constant references to people going to the East Indies.
Yes, yes. Of course, the East Indies, I think they really mean even further than Turkey at that point. I think they're talking about India, because
Right.
we had so much trade going on, and we were
Right.
trying to completely dominate India politically and make it a colony, which I guess it was. I don't know exactly when you characterize it as a colony, or when are we just doing trade and being kind of dominating, we, the Anglo people in general. Britain, but they certainly, they loved those fabrics, and those beautiful soft muslins, and those incredibly beautiful, delicate, saris, and the beautifully embroidered or woven Kashmiri shawls, were all coming out of there, and they were all just the hottest thing you could have.
Yeah, I'm seeing that in the novel Northanger Abbey.
Hmm. Hmm. That's right. There's a lot of talk about the muslin and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So that leads me to my question about
Okay.
Regency dress and source
Yes.
fabrics. Where did these fabrics come from? Because I'm assuming you had wool, you just mentioned silk, linen, there was cotton, which I think came both from the Americas or the United States and India,
Well,
maybe.
there's a difference between the raw material and the finished product, but yes, first of all, it's an amazingly global market. And really, the textile market has been global since the early Middle Ages. I mean, the Silk Road was bringing things from all over. And then, you see these beautiful things coming from China and India and the East, and everybody wants to copy it. So then, in Italy and France and England and other places are all trying to make their own silks to imitate the beautiful things coming out of the East. And the Indian cottons, the Indian printed and painted and printed cottons were so popular in the early 1700s that the wool manufacturers in Britain felt very threatened. They felt that their trade was being threatened. And so they actually banned Indian cottons in England for decades. But you could still get them in the colonies. So the North
Oh.
Americans could still get some printed cottons over here. So you had the cottons that were being woven and also embroidered. When you see those beautiful embroidered muslins, and that's often when they're called spotted muslins, that may mean printed, but uh, or it'll say worked muslins is another period term. But all of those sheer white muslins were being pre-embroidered by the people in India, and sent over here. And even the ones that are embroidered down the center of the skirt and all around the train, they know they were just pre-embroidered for the pattern, and then you would make it up. Um, and silks coming from India, silks coming from China, all the way, around the Horn, and to either Britain or America in the other direction. You had wool, of course, was one of the main products of big wool industry in England. So all those beautiful fine wools that made the men's coats and the women's redingotes and things like that. That's coming out of England. But even the linen is coming out of places in Germany, and there's Silesia and Holland. It's called a certain weight of linen became called Holland because it was the weight that you typically got from the Netherlands. Poland, Ireland, England. In America, we had some domestic production of that, like literally just, my father has a few acres of linen and I'm going to spin and weave some flax. Not as much as we think. We have this myth of homespun that suggests that, all of our, foremothers were sitting there spinning and weaving their own cloth and wearing their own homespun clothes. Hugely exaggerated. Most of the stuff was being imported. It's so time consuming at this point to make textiles that you would have had to spend every waking moment processing textiles to clothe your family. They've done the math. But anyway, it's being imported from all over all the time. And so at every level of society, you can get imported fabric from the very coarsest to the very finest, all over the globe practically.
It's fascinating what you say about the pre-embroidered cloth from India because we spoke several years ago with she's a designer working out of England, but she was telling us about how much of the couture fashion is actually being constructed and using uh, artisans in India.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, of course, their artistry goes back centuries, and they
Yes.
figured out how to do this a really long time ago. And they were also incredibly good at making things for different markets. So you can see some Indian printed cottons that were made for the Indonesian market or the Chinese market, and they will look completely different. And you can even see things that were made for the French market versus the Dutch market versus the English market. The Dutch loved red backgrounds and other darker backgrounds, and the English did not. The Americans loved a brown background of cotton because, it was, I don't know, maybe more practical. I don't know. Some of that was being commissioned by the, Dutch East India, the India Company, or the English East India Company, saying, okay, we're going to commission you to do this because this is what our people like. But the Indians themselves also had a good sense of what these different markets were interested in. So they
Mm.
have been very sophisticated, very, very talented artisans and marketers for a long time.
Wow. And we can't ignore the fact that in Jane Austen's time and during this time of global textile importing, exporting, we can't have the conversation without mentioning the word empire. I mean, empire just does not
Absolutely. This
only
is an
refer to a dress.
Yes. No, it is empire and it is colonization and it is appropriation and it is, domination of that culture. And also, as we were saying, the cotton, the raw material cotton is coming from the American colonies, but southern colonies in the southern states, but also from the Caribbean. And of course, that gets touched on just a tiny bit in Emma, where Mrs. Elton gets offended that she thinks someone's referring to the slave trade, but also a little bit more in Mansfield Park, because of course the Mansfields have property in the Caribbean, and so that's where a lot of their wealth is coming from, and so there is that dirty little background story to all of that.
Yeah, I think Sanditon, the series, tried to allude to that with the
Yes,
sugar boycott
the
and
sugar boycott and talking about
Georgiana Lamb.
pineapple.
Yes.
And, for her having an Afro-Caribbean, character, was really very cool. It's really interesting to wonder where Jane Austen might have taken that if she had lived longer.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about how do you buy these clothes? I mean,
Right.
in the Regency time, or the Federal time,
Right.
or both, um,
Well,
there was no off the rack, I'm
pretty much no
assuming.
off the rack. There
Yeah.
was a tiny bit of off the rack. You could buy something like a cloak, like those red cloaks that you
Mm,
see,
yeah, that would
the
make sense.
various characters in various adaptations wearing, because you don't need to fit a cloak. Quilted petticoats, which are not in this period because they're too bulky, but the 18th century quilted petticoats, those could be embroidered in professional workshops by embroiderers, and you just bought the panel and you pleated it into a waistband that fit you, and bingo, you've got a quilted petticoat. And there's a huge secondhand market. So if you're a little bit further down on the social scale, you can buy something secondhand, and maybe you know how to take it in or fit it yourself, or maybe you spend a little money on a local dressmaker to help you make it fit better. But yes, by and large, it's not at all ready to wear. So you go to the dry goods store, the mercer or the haberdasher, in England is what they're usually called. And there's a different. I think the mercer sells silk and something, and the haberdasher is more different accessories. I've never really been able to get the difference between them. You'll have to look. People are going to have to do some googling, but you go to the store and you buy your fabric and you bring it to your dressmaker, who is called a mantua maker. The mantua being a now obsolete for 100 years garment of the 18th century, but they're still being called mantua makers. Sometimes they're called a gown maker. And you say, okay, I bought this great blue fabric and I want to make a dress. And now you get together with her and you co design it. And you might
Mhm.
say, okay, I really like this other dress of mine, but I'm seeing in the fashion plates that sleeves are getting a little bigger. So let's do that. But I don't like it quite that big. I think that looks a little weird, or I'm not willing to go that far out. Or let's combine this fashion plate sleeve with this bodice because I think this will be more flattering to me. And what should we do? And there's maybe I have I'm bringing you a sari fabric and it's got a beautiful border to it. So let's make you the best use of that border. And oh, by the way, I saw Mrs. Johnson at church last Sunday and she had this really cool thing and I want to try to imitate that. So you're drawing your inspiration from your own wardrobe, from your own community, from the fashion plates that you're seeing, and you're getting the advice from your trusted dressmaker who might say, "Well, Mrs. Johnson, I really think this neckline is best on you." Now, there's not a whole lot of variation in necklines, so at this period, so I'm kind of making this up. You've got more agency and more involvement in designing your own clothes with the help of a trusted dressmaker who knows the styles, who has been to Boston or Philadelphia or Baltimore or London or Edinburgh, whatever the biggest city near you is, they go and check out the latest every 6 months or whatever, and they come back. And we know this from the newspaper advertisements, which say, Mrs. Miller is just back from London, lately arrived from London, or just back from Boston, or just back from Philadelphia with the latest styles. And so you work together to do this kind of thing. Now, to do this, since there's no ready-made, having a dressmaker is not the sort of incredibly elite, posh thing to do. Everyone has to get their thing made, and not everybody has really good dressmaking skills to do it. So there are going to be modistes, as they later get called, or dressmakers or mantua makers who are catering to different levels of society. And what you might just have is someone in your little town or village who is just really good at dressmaking, and she's not a full-time dressmaker, but she does it, on the side. And what you also might find, because this is a period where, if you think about those styles, this is a period where, instead of having draped the gown on the 18th century form and having to, do all this geometric pleating to the corseted form and so on, now we've got sort of flat patterns. They're not selling paper patterns at this point, and dressmakers are still making the transition from draping a pattern on your individual body. But once you lay it out, you can look at that flat pattern. It's a front bodice piece, it's a side bodice piece, it's two back bodice pieces. It's often on a drawstring, either front or back or both. It's not complicated pattern making. And the skirts are just basically tubes of fabric. Sometimes there's a gore to, to add to it. Okay, fine. But it's not incredibly complicated dressmaking. So, and everybody knows how to sew to a certain extent. So what you might do, and the etiquette books and the advice manuals and the housekeeping, how to keep a house on a budget and how to sew, all of the advice manuals tell women this in both America and England throughout the 19th century, even after things get more complicated. Go to a dressmaker and at least get her to make you a really well-fitted bodice. And then you can copy that pattern, and you can make more things yourself. And so you could do that in the Regency too, very, very easily. And you sometimes would get the dressmaker to fit all of it yourself, but then you fit it so that it's all nicely fitted to your body, the way you want it to. And then you might do the actual sewing, because that skirt is just a whole lot of running stitches, and you just can sit at home and sew that in a couple of days. So some people were combining using the skills of the dressmaker with using their own sewing skills. But, people like Caroline Bingley and Mrs. Hurst, her sister, people like Emma, oh no, they're using the dressmaker. They're not making their own things at all. They're just going to let someone else do that. So you have some differences along the social scale. But even Harriet Smith, she has a generous father who's paying her way and so on. But she talks about, oh, well, I need to get a dress made. But she talks about her pattern gown. She said, oh, I don't have my pattern gown with her. And what she means is it's the gown that a dressmaker has made for her. And it's the one she uses as a pattern for making more gowns, which she might cut out for herself, or she might take to a dressmaker there in Highgrove. So those are some of the different iterations of using a dressmaker that you might do depending on your budget.
So if you want something quick, that's not
Forget
gonna
about
happen.
it.
You better borrow.
Well, on the other hand, again, these are not extremely elaborate gowns. So if you have an in with your dressmaker and she is willing to put aside some other projects, and because you say, oh my God, someone just died, I need a black dress, I don't have any mourning, please, I've got to have this in the next couple of days. Or, I have this other urgent need. It is possible to get a gown made in a day. especially if you're a dressmaker who has some assistants, or if you say, okay, you sew the skirt, I'll sew the bodice. It is not going to take a long, long time because these things are not that elaborate. Now, if you look at some of the things that, the really fancy London ladies are wearing, those are somewhat more elaborate because of the trim, and they may have different layers of elaborate, beautiful fabrics combined. The 1995 Pride and Prejudice does a really nice job of showing that kind of difference, where the London ladies, this is Hearst and Caroline Bingley, have much more elaborate gowns. They're more highly colored, and they're more fancy silks. But if you look at them, they've got a lot more components to them that they would have paid a dressmaker to make, whereas the Bennet sisters all have much simpler gowns.
In part 2 of our conversation with Alden O'Brien, we talk about how clothes make the character in 3 adaptations of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice: the 1995 A&E series, the 2005 feature film, and the upcoming adaptation from Netflix based on a first-look photo.
I don't know if that's Mary or who in the middle with the sort of ruffled cloak and the beret kind of effect, but she's chosen a very different look. I sometimes think, poor old Mary, I wonder how much of all of her moralizing and everything is really sincere, or whether she's just like the middle of 5 has to carve out an identity in some way.
And if you're into cosplay or attending a Jane Austen-themed ball, Alden O'Brien shares some advice for Regency-style success. Subscribe to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters so you won't miss our Jane Austen Adapted miniseries, including part 2 of our conversation with Alden O'Brien on December 2nd. Thank you for catching this episode of Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters. We hope you enjoyed our exploration of captivating historical films and series dramas. Find us on Instagram at Historical Drama Sisters and on Facebook at Historical Drama Boston Sisters.
We want to hear from you. What historical dramas are you watching? Share your favorites. We may feature them in a future episode. Don't forget to subscribe. Visit our website at michonnebostongroup.com/Boston Sisters and share the podcast with fellow historical drama enthusiasts.
Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters is brought to you by the Michonne Boston Group. The views and opinions expressed on Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters are those of the speakers and do not represent the positions or views of the Michonne Boston Group, its clients, or affiliates. This is Michonne Boston.
And this is Tequina Boston.
Thank you for listening.